I was standing in the center of what used to be my life, choking on a thick cloud of pulverized drywall, staring at the sky through a gaping hole in my ceiling. My $50,000, money I had bled for, worked double shifts for, sacrificed 5 years of vacations and dinners out for, was gone. And the man who stole it wasn't some shadowy con artist who skipped town in the dead of night. He was standing right in front of me at a family barbecue, holding a craft beer in one hand and a plate of ribs in the other, laughing so hard he was practically crying. "What are you gonna do, babe?" he choked out, wiping a tear of pure mirth from his eye while my husband stood silently beside him, staring at his shoes. "Sue me? Good luck getting a judge to care about family drama. I spent it. It's gone. Welcome to the family." He took another bite of his ribs, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just rendered me practically homeless. That was the exact moment the woman who had spent 32 years trying to keep the peace finally snapped, and the woman who was going to systematically dismantle his entire pathetic existence was born. But to understand how I ended up standing in the rubble of my own home, contemplating murder over a paper plate of lukewarm potato salad, you have to understand the toxic ecosystem I married into. Let's rewind exactly 2 months. My name is irrelevant, but my bank account balance at the time was the single most important number in my world: $50,214.88. That number represented exactly 5 years, 4 months, and 12 days of relentless, obsessive financial discipline. When my husband, Mark, and I bought our house, it was a fixer-upper in the most generous sense of the phrase. It was a charming, mid-century ranch sitting on a beautiful half-acre lot, but the interior was frozen in a tragic 1970s time capsule. We tackled the easy stuff ourselves: painting, ripping up the shag carpet to expose the hardwood, swapping out light fixtures. But the kitchen was a different beast entirely. It was a nightmare of rotting particle board cabinets, peeling mustard yellow linoleum, and a layout so claustrophobic that opening the oven door meant you couldn't open the refrigerator. The electrical panel was a localized fire hazard. Running the microwave and the toaster simultaneously would trip the breaker, plunging half the house into darkness. I am a logistics manager for a mid-sized supply chain firm. My entire brain is wired for efficiency, planning, and risk mitigation. So I didn't just dream of a new kitchen, I engineered a path to it. Every bonus I earned, every tax refund, every spare dollar we saved by meal prepping instead of ordering takeout went into a high-yield savings account dubbed the Kitchen Fund. I spent my evenings poring over architectural blueprints, researching the durability of quartz versus quartzite, and vetting local, highly rated design-build firms. Mark, bless his heart, is a good man. He is kind, he is gentle, and he loves me. But Mark is also a chronic people-pleaser, possessing a spine composed entirely of overcooked spaghetti whenever he is within a 5-mile radius of his mother, Eleanor, or his older brother, Chad. Chad is the golden child. Chad is the kind of guy who peaked in high school, coasted on his varsity football jacket for a decade, and then somehow stumbled into a lifestyle that projected massive wealth with zero discernible foundation. He drove a monstrous, lifted Ford F-250 with immaculately polished chrome rims that had definitively never encountered a single speck of job site mud. He lived in a sprawling, gaudy McMansion in a gated subdivision, wore designer sunglasses indoors, and constantly referred to himself as an entrepreneur. Specifically, he claimed to run Chadwick Custom Contracting, a business that, as far as I could tell, consisted entirely of him posting Instagram stories of himself holding a Yeti tumbler on various construction sites while pointing vaguely at piles of lumber. I despised him, not just because he was arrogant, but because his entire existence was a carefully curated illusion, and his primary hobby was belittling Mark. The collision course between my $50,000 and Chad's ego began on a Tuesday in late March. I had finally found them: Evergreen Design and Build. They were a boutique, fully licensed, bonded, and insured contracting firm with a portfolio of stunning kitchen remodels and a flawless reputation with the Better Business Bureau. The lead architect, a brilliant woman named Sarah, had walked through my disaster of a kitchen, listened to my meticulous list of needs, and handed me a comprehensive, itemized proposal. The cost? $48,500. It covered demolition, structural reinforcement, custom cabinetry, plumbing relocation, and all the finishes. It was perfect. It was everything I had worked for. That Friday, high on the adrenaline of finally making my dream a reality, I made the fatal mistake of bringing the proposal to the weekly family dinner at my mother-in-law's house. Sunday dinners at Aliner's were less of a meal and more of a hostage situation. You were expected to arrive exactly at 4 p.m., praise her dry pot roast, and listen to Chad talk about how much money he was supposedly making. We were sitting around the dining room table, the air thick with the smell of overcooked beef and Chad's cheap cologne. Mark, in a rare moment of excitement, brought it up. "We're finally doing it," Mark announced, beaming at me. "She saved up the money. We're gutting the kitchen next month." The clinking of silverware stopped. Eleanor looked up from her plate, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, that's nice. I thought you two were trying to save for a baby." "We can do both, Mom," Mark said defensively. "But the kitchen is literally falling apart. We got a quote from Evergreen Design and Build. They're amazing." From across the table, Chad let out a loud, obnoxious snort. He leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs into the belt loops of his designer jeans. "Evergreen? Are you kidding me, little bro? Those guys are corporate hacks. They're gonna overcharge you by 40% just to cover their fancy office overhead." I felt the familiar prickle of annoyance at the back of my neck. "Actually, Chad," I said, keeping my voice level and professional, "their quote was incredibly reasonable, and they provided a highly detailed, itemized breakdown of materials and labor. They also carry full liability insurance." Chad waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Insurance schminsurance, it's a kitchen, not a skyscraper. What did they quote you?" I hesitated. I didn't want to tell him. But Mark, ever eager to prove he was an adult to his older brother, blurted it out. 50 grand, but she has the cash." The entire room went dead silent. I watched as Chad's eyes visibly widened. A flicker of something predatory passed over his face, quickly masked by a wide, predatory grin. It was the look of a wolf who had just been told there was an unattended fat sheep in the next pasture. 50 grand? Chad whistled. "Man, you are getting absolutely hosed." He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table, suddenly the picture of brotherly concern. "Look, Mark, your family. I can't sit here and let some slick corporate suit rob my little brother blind. Cancel the contract with Evergreen." "We haven't signed it yet," Mark mumbled. "Good," Chad said, slamming his hand on the table, making the water glasses rattle. "Because I'll do it. Chadwick Custom Contracting will take the job. I'll give you the family discount. We'll do it for the 50 grand, but I'll give you premium upgrades. Granite instead of quartz. Soft close everything. Hell, I'll even throw in a custom wine fridge at cost. We keep the money in the family." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. "Chad, no. That's a very generous offer, but we really want to go with a firm that specializes in this specific type of structural remodel. We have to tear down a wall." "I tear down walls in my sleep, sweetheart," Chad interrupted, giving me a patronizing wink. "It's basic framing. You think those Evergreen guys have magic hammers? Wood is wood. Drywall is drywall." I looked at Mark, my eyes pleading with him to shut this down. To say no. To be my husband and protect the 5 years of sacrifice I had just laid at his feet. Instead, Mark looked at his mother. Eleanor placed her fork down with a delicate, deliberate clink. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression of profound, theatrical disappointment. "I have to say," she began, her voice dripping with maternal sorrow, "I find it deeply hurtful that you would even consider handing $50,000 to complete strangers when your own brother-in-law owns a contracting business." "Eleanor, it's not personal," I tried to explain, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It's a massive financial investment. Evergreen has a team of architects. Chad is a professional," Eleanor cut in smoothly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He built that beautiful deck for the Jenkins last summer." "Mom, a deck is not a load-bearing kitchen remodel," I argued, my voice rising a fraction of an inch. "Money," Eleanor said, pronouncing the word as if it were holy scripture, "stays in the family. When family has a business, you support them. That is what families do. Unless, of course, you think you're too good for Chad's work. The trap had been sprung. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. If I refused, I was the snooty, elitist daughter-in-law who thought she was better than her hardworking brother-in-law. I would be the one, tearing the family apart. Mom's right, Mark said softly. I whipped my head to look at him, feeling a profound sense of betrayal. Mark, we talked about this. We spent months finding Evergreen. Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared down at his half-eaten roast. I know, but Chad's right too. They're probably overcharging us, and it would be good to have family doing it. We can trust him. Trust him? I hissed, forgetting my indoor voice. He hasn't even looked at the house. I'll come by tomorrow, Chad said cheerfully, leaning back and taking a long swig of his beer. Draft up a material list. We'll get this knocked out in 3 weeks tops, easy money. You're gonna love it, sis. The drive home that night was the quietest, most agonizing 30 minutes of my life. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. The moment we pulled into the driveway and the engine cut off, the dam broke. Are you out of your mind? I exploded, turning in my seat to face him. You just handed my $50,000, my money, Mark, money I saved, to your brother. He doesn't even do kitchen remodels. He builds fences and decks. Mark shrank against the driver's side door. Babe, please calm down. He's a contractor. He knows what he's doing. And you saw Mom. You know how she gets. If we didn't hire him, we would never hear the end of it. She'd freeze us out. Thanksgiving, Christmas, everything would be ruined. So my kitchen has to be ruined so you don't have to endure your mother's pouting? I demanded, tears of sheer frustration burning in my eyes. Mark, he is going to mess this up. I can feel it in my bones. He won't, Mark pleaded, reaching out to take my hand. I pulled it away. I promise he won't. I'll stay on top of him. I'll make sure he does a good job. Please, let's just do this to keep the peace. It's just a kitchen. Family is forever. Family is forever, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. And $50,000 is a hell of a lot of money. We fought until 2 a.m. We argued in circles. Mark begged, he cried, he promised he would act as the project manager. He swore that if Chad messed up even one tiny detail, he would fire him immediately. He leveraged every ounce of our marital equity to get me to yield. And eventually, exhaustedly, tragically, I did. I capitulated, not because I trusted Chad. God, no. I trusted Chad about as much as I trusted a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. I capitulated because I looked at my husband, the man I loved, and realized that forcing him to stand up to his mother and brother was going to break him. I valued my marriage more than I valued my dream kitchen. But I was an accountant of risk, and I refused to go down without a safety net. Fine, I whispered into the dark of our bedroom, staring at the ceiling. He can do it. But on one condition, we are treating him like a vendor. He signs a legal contract, a real one, outlining milestones, deadlines, material specifications, and liability. If he doesn't sign it, he doesn't get a dime. Of course, Mark agreed eagerly, relieved that the fight was over. Whatever you want, I'll tell him tomorrow. I spent the next 3 days drafting a contract that would have made a corporate lawyer weep with joy. I downloaded templates, consulted a friend in real estate, and meticulously outlined every single aspect of the job. I included clauses for delays, clauses for material substitutions, and most importantly, a clause stating that Chadwick Custom Contracting was fully responsible for any structural damage incurred during the project. On Thursday evening, Chad swaggered into my old, cramped kitchen. He didn't bring a tape measure. He didn't bring a notepad. He brought a large iced coffee and a demeanor that suggested he was doing me a massive, charitable favor. All right, let's see this dump, he said, slapping the flimsy particle board counter. Yeah, we're gonna gut all this. Tear down that wall between the living room and here. Open concept, baby. It's gonna be sick. About that wall, I said, stepping forward, a thick manila folder clutched to my chest like a shield. We had an engineer look at it when we bought the house. It's load-bearing. You're going to need to install an LVL beam before you remove the studs. Chad rolled his eyes behind his sunglasses. He was wearing sunglasses inside. At 6 p.m. Relax, sweetheart. I know what a load-bearing wall is. I've been doing this since you were in college. I'll throw a beam up there, no sweat. Where's the check? My stomach plummeted. Every instinct screaming at me to kick him out of my house, I looked at Mark. Mark gave me an encouraging, pleading nod. I opened the manila folder and placed the 10-page contract on the counter, along with a pen. Here is the scope of work agreement. It details the timeline, the material specifications, and the payment schedule. Once you review and sign this, I will hand you the deposit for materials. Chad stared at the contract, then he looked at me, then he looked at Mark. And then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, braying sound that echoed off the peeling linoleum walls. "Are you serious right now?" he wheezed, wiping his nose. "A contract? For family? You're making me sign paperwork to remodel your kitchen? What is this, a Fortune 500 merger?" "It's standard business practice, Chad," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "If you are a professional, you shouldn't have a problem with a professional agreement." Chad shook his head, still chuckling, treating me like a precocious, slightly annoying child. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, little lady. Give me the pen." He didn't read a single word of it. He flipped to the back page, scribbled his signature with a flourish, and tossed the pen across the counter. "There, the sacred scrolls are signed. Now the money. I need to get the materials ordered tomorrow morning." My hands were shaking. I reached into my purse, pulled out my checkbook, and uncapped my own pen. The cashier's check I had prepared at the bank earlier that day felt heavier than lead. It was made out to Chadwick Custom Contracting LLC for the amount of $50,000. I had agreed to give him the full amount up front. It was a massive mistake, breaking every rule of contracting, but Chad had insisted that to get the family discount and secure the premium materials at cost, he needed the liquid capital immediately. Mark had begged me to trust him. I looked at the check. $50,000. 5 years of my life. 5 years of saying no to vacations, of driving a 10-year-old car, of meticulously tracking every penny on a spreadsheet. Slowly, feeling as though I were operating underwater, I extended my hand and offered the check to Chad. He snatched it from my fingers with the speed of a striking cobra. He didn't even look at the amount. He just folded it in half, shoved it carelessly into the back pocket of his designer jeans, and gave me a 2-finger salute. "Pleasure doing business with you," Chad grinned, his teeth blindingly white against his fake tan. "I'll have my demo crew here on Monday morning. Enjoy your last weekend in this dump." He turned and swaggered out the front door. A few seconds later, I heard the deafening roar of his lifted truck's diesel engine firing up, rattling the windows of my living room as he sped out of the driveway. Mark wrapped his arms around me from behind, kissing the top of my head. "See, that wasn't so bad. He's going to do a great job. It's going to be beautiful." I didn't answer. I just stood there in my cramped, outdated kitchen, staring at the empty space on the counter where my $50,000 had been sitting moments before. The house was perfectly quiet, but in my chest, an alarm bell had begun to ring, a frantic, deafening siren of impending doom. Because as I looked at the wall Chad was planning to tear down on Monday, the wall holding up the entire second half of my roof, I realized I had just handed a sledgehammer and my entire life savings to a man who didn't even own a tape measure. Monday morning arrived with a suffocating blanket of anxiety. I had set my alarm for 6 a.m., brewed a pot of coffee in the dining room, where we had temporarily relocated the microwave and a mini fridge, and waited for the demo crew. Mark had left for work at 7:30, kissing my cheek and whispering that everything was going to be great. By 9 a.m., the driveway was empty. By 10 a.m., I was pacing the hardwood floors, my phone clutched in my sweating hand. Finally, at 10:45 a.m., the familiar, obnoxious roar of Chad's diesel engine shattered the quiet of our suburban street. He didn't pull into the driveway. He parked the massive truck halfway on our front lawn, crushing a bed of hostas I had planted the previous spring. I opened the front door to find Chad strolling up the walkway. He wasn't wearing work boots or a tool belt. He was wearing pristine white sneakers, designer athletic shorts, and a tight black t-shirt. In his right hand, he held a sleek, brand-new sledgehammer with the price tag still dangling from the handle. In his left hand, he held his iPhone, attached to a portable ring light. "Chadwick Custom Contracting, coming at you live," he yelled into the phone, grinning at the camera. "It is demo day, baby. We are about to tear this 1970s disaster down to the studs." Stay tuned. He hit a button on the screen, slipped the phone into his pocket, and breezed past me into the house without saying a word of greeting. "Where is your crew?" I asked, following him into the kitchen. "Crew? What crew?" Chad scoffed, tossing the sledgehammer onto the Formica counter with a heavy thud. "For this, I'm a one-man wrecking ball today, sweetheart. Gotta get the baseline footage for the gram." For the next 45 minutes, I stood in the doorway of the dining room and watched a grown man play dress-up as a contractor. Chad set his phone up on a tripod on the kitchen island. He hit record, picked up the sledgehammer, and began wildly swinging at the upper cabinets. He didn't score the drywall to prevent tearing. He didn't turn off the water valves. He certainly didn't turn off the electricity. He just swung. Wood splintered and flew across the room. Decades-old dust cascaded through the air in a choking, gray waterfall. I watched in absolute horror as the head of his sledgehammer missed a cabinet door entirely and smashed directly into the drywall, missing an electrical outlet by a fraction of an inch. "Chad, stop!" I shrieked over the noise of crashing particle board. "You have to shut the breaker off first. And where is the plastic sheeting? You're getting dust all over the living room furniture." Chad lowered the hammer, breathing slightly heavily, his face flushed with exertion. He looked at me, annoyed that I had ruined his take. "Relax, OSHA, I'm just getting the aesthetic shots. The dust will settle. Besides, I'm done for today." "Done?" I echoed, staring at the chaotic debris field that used to be my kitchen. Splintered wood, rusty screws, and jagged chunks of drywall littered the floor. "It's 11:30 in the morning." "Yeah, well, demo is exhausting work. Plus, I gotta go finalize the granite orders with my supplier." "You want premium stone, right? That takes time to source." He picked up his phone, reviewed the footage with a satisfied smirk and grabbed his keys. "I'll be back, keep the dog out of the sharp stuff." And just like that, he walked out. I spent 4 hours that afternoon sweeping up the shattered remains of my cabinets and taping thick plastic sheeting over the archways to stop the toxic, metallic-smelling dust from infiltrating the rest of my house. I thought he meant he would be back the next day, but Tuesday came and went, then Wednesday, then an entire week. For 14 straight days, my kitchen sat in a state of suspended devastation. We had no sink, no stove, and a pile of sharp, hazardous debris stacked in the corner that Chad had promised he would haul to the dump tomorrow. We lived on microwaved soup and dry cereal. Every time I tried to call Chad, it went straight to voicemail. When I texted him, I got automated replies or vague promises. "Waiting on the permits, babe. Supplier is backed up." "Got a minor emergency on another site, be there ASAP." Mark, of course, defended him. Every single night, sitting on the couch amidst the thin layer of dust that had coated our entire lives, Mark made excuses. "He's sourcing the materials, honey. You can't rush perfection. This is how construction works. There's always downtime." "Mark, he hasn't even pulled a permit," I argued, my voice tight with a panic I was desperately trying to suppress. "I checked the city portal. There is no active permit for our address." "He probably filed it under a master permit," Mark lied to himself, refusing to meet my eyes. "Just give him time." The time ran out on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 16 days after the initial demo day. I was working from home, huddled at a makeshift desk in the guest bedroom, when the front door banged open. I jumped, my heart hammering, as the sound of loud, aggressive rap music flooded the hallway. I hurried out of the room to find Chad standing in the foyer, accompanied by 2 men who looked less like professional carpenters and more like guys you would avoid making eye contact with at a gas station at 2 a.m. One was wearing a stained tank top and smoking a vape, the other looked dangerously hungover and was carrying a rusted crowbar. "All right, boys, let's open this mother up." Chad yelled over the music blaring from a portable Bluetooth speaker he had set on my dining table. "Chad, what is going on?" I demanded, running into the kitchen. "Who are these people?" "This is the A-team, sis," Chad grinned, slapping the guy with the vape on the back. "Tony and, Steve, they're my elite framing crew. Today, we're taking down that wall." He pointed a finger at the exact wall the structural engineer had warned me about, the load-bearing wall separating the kitchen from the vaulted living room ceiling. "No. Absolutely not," I said, stepping between him and the wall. "Where is the LVL beam? Where are the temporary support jacks? You can't just take a sledgehammer to a load-bearing structure, Chad. Chad's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, ugly anger. His ego had been challenged in front of his crew. Look, I told you I know what I'm doing, he snapped, taking a step toward me, using his height to try and intimidate me. I don't need you backseat driving my job site. You wanted an open concept, I'm giving you an open concept. Now step aside and let the men work, or I'm walking off the job right now. It was a bluff, a manipulative, aggressive bluff. But my mind flashed to the $50,000 he already had in his pocket. If he walked away now, the money was gone, and I was left with a demolished room. The paralysis of the sunk cost fallacy gripped me by the throat. I hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. That's what I thought, Chad muttered, turning his back to me. Tony, take the center. Steve, hit the corners. Let's drop this thing. I backed away into the living room, a sickening knot forming in my stomach. I watched as the two men raised their tools. Tony swung a massive sledgehammer directly into the center of the drywall. Steve shoved the crowbar between two exposed studs and wrenched sideways. They didn't measure. They didn't brace. They just blindly destroyed. The drywall came down in massive, powdery chunks, exposing the wooden skeleton of the house. For a moment, nothing happened. Chad was laughing, high-fiving Tony. See, easy money. And then I heard it. It started as a low, agonizing groan. A sound of immense, unbearable pressure, like the hull of a submarine giving way. It didn't come from the wall, it came from above us. What was that? Steve asked, lowering his crowbar. The groan escalated into a sharp, terrifying crack that echoed through the house like a gunshot. I looked up. The ceiling in the living room, a beautiful, smooth expanse of white plaster, suddenly shuddered. A long, jagged fissure ripped across the center of it, branching out like lightning. As I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror, the center of the ceiling visibly bowed downward by at least 3 inches. Chad, I whispered, the air leaving my lungs. A shower of white dust drifted down from the crack. Then, another deafening crack. Behind the wall they had just compromised, a copper water pipe, violently bent by the sudden shifting of the house's weight, snapped. A high-pressure geyser of brown, stagnant water erupted from the wall, blasting directly into an exposed, dangling electrical junction box that Chad hadn't bothered to cap. Sparks rained down like a miniature fireworks display, accompanied by the angry, buzzing zap of short-circuiting wires. The lights in the entire house flickered wildly, then died, plunging us into a dusty, water-soaked gloom. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of gushing water flooding my hardwood floors and the terrifying, continuous groaning of the sagging ceiling above our heads. Tony and Steve dropped their tools instantly. "Bro, I'm out," Tony said, his eyes wide with panic. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted for the front door, Steve hot on his heels. Chad stood frozen, staring at the geyser of water and the bowed ceiling. His bravado was entirely gone, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed look of a child who had just set the curtains on fire. "The water!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Turn off the main. Turn off the main." I ran past him, slipping on the rapidly expanding puddle, and tore down the basement stairs into the dark to find the water shut-off valve. By the time I wrestled the rusted wheel closed and the rushing sound of water above me stopped, I was completely soaked, shaking violently, and covered in grime. I walked back upstairs, my breath catching in my throat. The kitchen was unrecognizable. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The smell of wet plaster and ozone hung heavy in the air. The ceiling in the living room was dipping dangerously low, looking as though it could collapse entirely at any second. Chad was standing by the front door, furiously typing on his phone. "You broke the structural integrity of the house," I said, my voice eerily calm, trembling with a rage so profound it felt cold. "You hit a live wire. You flooded the floor. Where are you going?" Chad didn't look up from his phone. "Look, it's a minor setback. The wood up there must have been rotted. It's not my fault the house is a piece of crap. I gotta go get some heavy-duty jacks from the supply yard, and a plumber. I'll be right back." "You're leaving?" I asked, staring at him. "I have to get supplies," he yelled defensively, finally looking at me. "I can't fix it standing here. I'll be back in an hour." He practically ran out the door. The diesel engine roared to life, tires squealing as he peeled off my lawn and down the street. I stood alone in the dark, ruined shell of my home. An hour passed, then 2, then 5. I called him 20 times. Every single call went straight to voicemail. When Mark got home from work that evening and walked through the front door, he stopped dead in his tracks. The color completely drained from his face as he took in the bowed ceiling, the flooded floors, the dangling, sparking wires, and the sheer devastation. I was sitting on the floor in the dining room, my knees pulled to my chest, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the destruction. "Oh my God," Mark breathed, dropping his briefcase. What happened? Where's Chad?" "He's gone, Mark," I whispered. "He broke the house and he left." We slept in a hotel that night. The next day, a city inspector, whom I had to call anonymously, pretending I saw a hazard through the window so I wouldn't implicate myself in unpermitted work, slapped a massive, neon orange, "Condemned. Unsafe for habitation" sticker on my front door. The structural damage was so severe that the house was deemed an immediate collapse risk. We had to move into Mark's childhood bedroom at Aliner's house. It was the ultimate humiliation. For 3 days, Chad vanished off the face of the earth. He didn't answer texts from me or Mark. Aliner claimed he was very busy with a massive corporate contract and told us we were being impatient. I was living out of a suitcase in a house that smelled like mothballs and judgment, while my own home sat rotting and collapsing a few miles away. The breaking point arrived on Sunday. The family barbecue. Aliner had insisted on hosting a celebration for Mark's aunt's birthday. I had refused to go, but Mark had begged me. "Please," he had said, tears in his eyes. "Chad will be there. We can talk to him face to face. We can figure this out like adults. Just come. Keep the peace." And so, I found myself standing in Aliner's immaculate, blooming backyard, holding a paper plate of lukewarm potato salad, suffocating under the weight of my ruined life. And there he was. Chad was holding court by the grill, wearing a brand new, expensive-looking linen shirt, a craft beer in one hand and a plate of ribs in the other. He looked rested, tanned, and entirely unbothered. He was laughing loudly at a joke his uncle had just told. I walked up to him. The chatter around the grill died down as the family noticed my approach. Mark trailed a few steps behind me, looking like a man walking to his own execution. "Chad," I said, my voice cutting through the humid summer air. "We need to talk now." Chad slowly turned to look at me, taking a long, exaggerated sip of his beer. "Hey sis. Look, I know you're stressed about the little hiccup at the house." "A hiccup?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You tore down a load-bearing wall without a support beam. You severed a main water line. The city condemned the house. We are officially homeless, Chad. I need the $50,000 back. Today, I have to hire a structural engineering firm to come and literally save the roof from caving in." Aliner, hovering nearby with a tray of deviled eggs, gasped. "Don't use that tone with your brother-in-law. He is doing his best. Construction is unpredictable." I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked on Chad. "The contract stated that you were responsible for any structural negligence. You breached the contract, you abandoned the job site. I want the money back." Chad stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The fake, brotherly warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating amusement. He looked around at his family, at his mother who was glaring at me, at his brother who was staring firmly at his own shoes, too terrified to speak. Chad realized in that moment that he held all the power. The family dynamic protected him. He took a bite of a rib, chewed it slowly, and swallowed. "I can't give you the money back," he said casually, taking another sip of his beer. "Why not?" I demanded, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You haven't bought any materials. There's no granite, there are no cabinets. Where is the $50,000? Chad grinned. It was a slow, malicious stretching of his lips. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it up for me to see. It was a photo of a brand new dual-engine luxury wakeboard boat, gleaming in the sun on a massive trailer. "Meet the watermark," Chad chuckled. "She's a beauty, ain't she? Put the down payment on her on Wednesday." Oh, and I had to get the truck's suspension completely rebuilt to tow her. Custom dual exhausts too. The world tilted on its axis. The roaring in my ears was so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. You bought a boat?" I whispered, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of his confession. With my kitchen money, with the money I gave you for materials. Hey, liquid capital is liquid capital, Chad shrugged, completely devoid of shame. Business was a little slow, I needed to reallocate some funds. You know how it is, cash flow. I'll get back to your house eventually, when I free up some more cash from another job. You stole from me, I stated, the words falling from my lips like stones. You took $50,000, destroyed my home, and bought a boat. Don't be dramatic, Alina snapped, stepping between us. He didn't steal it, you gave it to him. He's just managing his business finances. You will get your kitchen when Chad is ready. You need to stop suffocating him. I looked at Mark, my husband, my partner, the man who had promised to protect me. Mark, I pleaded, my voice cracking for the first time. Mark, say something. Tell him to give it back. He used our life savings to buy a toy. Mark looked up. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic, deeply ingrained terror of his mother and brother. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked at Alina. Maybe we just wait a little longer, babe, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. It's just money, we can't cause a huge legal thing with family. The betrayal was absolute. It was a physical blow to my chest, sharper and more devastating than the sound of my ceiling cracking. Chad watched this exchange with supreme satisfaction. He had won. He knew it, Alina knew it, and Mark knew it. He stepped closer to me, the smell of barbecue sauce and cheap beer washing over my face. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with untouchable arrogance, and delivered the words that would ultimately seal his fate. What are you gonna do, babe? He choked out, wiping a tear of pure mirth from his eye while my husband stood silently beside him, staring at his shoes. Sue me? Good luck getting a judge to care about family drama. I spent it. It's gone. Welcome to the family. He took another bite of his ribs, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just rendered me practically homeless. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my potato salad in his face. Instead, a profound, terrifying stillness washed over me. The suffocating panic, the tears, the desperation, it all instantly evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, icy clarity. I looked at Chad's smug face. I looked at Alina's righteous indignation. I looked at my husband's cowardly submission. I realized, in that perfectly still moment, that they genuinely believed I was trapped. They believed that the word family was a magic spell that bound me to their dysfunction, that forced me to absorb their abuse and theft with a smile. They thought I was a compliant, rule-following pushover who would eventually lower my head and accept my place in their toxic hierarchy. They forgot that I was a logistics manager. They forgot that I spent my life dismantling complex problems, identifying structural weaknesses, and executing ruthless, calculated solutions. Welcome to the family, he had said. I slowly lowered my paper plate to the patio table. I looked Chad dead in the eyes, allowing the faintest, coldest ghost of a smile to touch my lips. You're right, Chad, I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. Family is family, I'll see you around. I turned on my heel and walked out of the backyard, leaving Mark behind. I didn't drive back to Alina's house. I drove to a coffee shop, opened my laptop, and began to draft the war plan that would utterly and completely destroy Chadwick Custom Contracting, and the man who thought he could steal from me and walk away laughing. The iced Americano on the small, scratched wooden table of the coffee shop had completely melted, leaving a ring of condensation on the veneer, but I hadn't taken a single sip. I was operating on a frequency of adrenaline so pure and refined it felt like ice water in my veins. The sheer, suffocating panic that had gripped me for the past 3 weeks was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, vast, and terrifyingly calm landscape of objective calculation. I opened my laptop, connected to the shop's Wi-Fi, and opened a fresh Google Drive directory. I right-clicked, hit New Folder, and typed 2 words, Project Demolition. This was my element. Chad and Alina thought they had defeated me because I hadn't screamed or thrown a tantrum on their pristine patio. They mistook my silence for submission, failing to realize that a logistics manager doesn't throw tantrums. A logistics manager analyzes the supply chain of a problem, identifies the critical failure points, and engineers a comprehensive, systematic teardown. Chad had inadvertently given me the greatest gift an enemy could provide. He had underestimated me. I started with the paper trail. First, the contract. I pulled the heavy, 10-page document from my tote bag. It was the same contract Chad had laughed at, the one he had signed with a theatrical flourish without reading a single word. I carefully fed each page through a portable scanner app on my phone, uploading the high-resolution PDFs directly to the secure drive. I zoomed in on the final page. There it was, his scrawled signature, right beneath Clause 4.2, which explicitly stated that Chadwick Custom Contracting LLC assumes total and complete financial and legal liability for any structural damage, unpermitted work, or negligence occurring on the property during the scope of the project. Next came the financials. I logged into my bank portal. I pulled the digital image of the $50,000 cashier's check. It had been endorsed and deposited into an account at a regional credit union 3 days after I handed it to him. I downloaded the bank statement, the image of the cleared check, and the withdrawal receipt. That was Exhibit B then, the digital footprint. This required speed. If Chad possessed even a single brain cell that wasn't devoted to his own ego, he might eventually realize the danger of his social media presence. I opened Instagram on my desktop. I didn't just take screenshots. I used a third-party extension to download the raw video files. I downloaded the demo day video, saving the metadata that proved the date and time he had taken a sledgehammer to my cabinets. I went to his recent posts. There it was, a carousel of high-definition photos of the watermark, his massive new wakeboard boat. The caption read, "Newest addition to the fleet. Work hard, play harder. Cashflow hash boss moves lake life." I saved the photos. I saved the caption. I even saved the comments, including one from a friend asking how he afforded it, to which Chad had replied, "Just landed a fat 50K job up front, bro. Gotta reinvest in my mental health." Face with tears of joy. My jaw tightened, my teeth grinding together so hard my temples ached. Reinvest in my mental health. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the anger back down into the tight, compressed box in my chest. Emotion was the enemy of execution. I needed cold, hard data. I opened a new tab and navigated to the State Department of Consumer Protection's contractor licensing portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I typed in Chadwick Custom Contracting LLC. I hit enter. The screen loaded. I stared at the bright red text staring back at me. Status, DISSOLVED. Expiration date, October 14, 2023. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen. I refreshed the page just to be sure. It didn't change. Chad's license had expired nearly 3 years ago. According to the state's public records, the LLC had been administratively dissolved for failure to file annual reports and pay state licensing fees. A dark, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in a month. He wasn't just a terrible contractor. He wasn't just a negligent idiot who tore down a load-bearing wall. He was a ghost. He was operating an illegal, unlicensed, uninsured business, taking massive upfront cash payments and funneling them directly into his personal assets. I opened another tab, the City Municipal Building Department. I typed in my home address to check the public permit registry. I already knew what I would find, but I needed the official screenshot. No active permits found. By 9 p.m., my coffee was warm and bitter, the shop was closing, and my project demolition folder was a masterclass in forensic accounting. I had built a watertight, inescapable digital cage, but I knew that a folder full of PDFs wasn't enough to drop the hammer. I needed independent, irrefutable, professional witnesses. The next morning, I called off work for the week, citing a family emergency. It wasn't a lie. I was excising a tumor from my family tree. My first call was to David, the senior structural engineer at a highly reputable commercial firm in the city. I had found him by searching for expert witnesses used in major construction litigation. I explained the situation briefly, completely devoid of emotion. "I need an immediate, legally actionable assessment of a compromised load-bearing structure," I told him over the phone. "Money is not an issue for this consultation. I need your eyes on it today." My second call was to the State Building Inspector's regional office. I didn't call the city code enforcement. I bypassed the local bureaucracy and went straight to the state level, filing an emergency hazard report regarding unlicensed structural demolition. At 1 p.m. on Tuesday, I stood on the sidewalk in front of my condemned home. The neon orange sticker glared at me from the front door. A heavy-duty white utility truck pulled up, followed shortly by a gray sedan. David stepped out of the truck. He was a man in his late 50s, possessing the no-nonsense aura of someone who had spent 30 years looking at catastrophic failures of physics. The state inspector, a stern-faced woman named Miller, stepped out of the sedan holding a thick clipboard. "I appreciate you both coming out on such short notice," I said, handing them each a hard hat I had purchased from a hardware store that morning. I had also brought N95 masks. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The smell of damp, rotting wood, metallic dust, and stagnant water washed over us. David and Inspector Miller stepped inside. I watched as David stopped dead in his tracks in the living room, his head tilting upward. The crack in the ceiling had widened since Sunday. The bowing was now so severe that the plaster was visibly separating from the lath. "Good God," David muttered, pulling a heavy tactical flashlight from his belt. He shined the beam onto the splintered, exposed wood where Chad's crew had ripped the studs out. "Who did this?" "My brother-in-law," I said flatly. "He operates under the name Chadwick Custom Contracting. Or, he used to, before his license was dissolved 3 years ago." Inspector Miller's head snapped toward me, her pen halting on her clipboard. "Unlicensed?" And he took a sledgehammer to a primary load-bearing partition. "Without pulling a single municipal permit," I confirmed, handing her a printed copy of the city's blank permit registry for my address. He also severed a live copper plumbing line, resulting in significant water damage to the subfloor, and struck an uncapped electrical junction box. "The power has been cut at the main, and the water is off." For the next 3 hours, I followed them through the wreckage of my home in absolute silence. I watched as David set up laser levels, measuring the exact degree of deflection in the roof joists. I watched as he took high-resolution macro photographs of the fractured wood, the improper, non-existent, bracing, and the catastrophic failure points. I watched Inspector Miller meticulously document every single state building code that had been violated, writing furiously on her clipboard. "Ma'am," David finally said, taking off his mask as we stood on the front lawn. He looked visibly disturbed. In my professional opinion, one heavy snowstorm, or even a sustained high-wind event, would bring the second story of this house down into the living room. "The structural integrity has been critically compromised. The joists are entirely unsupported. This isn't just shoddy work, this is criminal negligence." "Can you put that exact phrasing in your official report?" I asked, pulling a notebook from my purse. "I will," David said firmly. "I'll have a comprehensive 40-page sealed engineering report on your desk by Thursday. It will include a mitigation plan and an estimated cost of structural recovery. Off the top of my head, you're looking at $30,000 to $40,000 just to stabilize the roof and fix the subfloor before you can even think about putting a kitchen back in." Inspector Miller handed me a carbon copy of a formidable-looking document. "This is an official state citation of hazardous, unpermitted demolition. I am escalating this to the state licensing board immediately. If he's operating without a license and causing this level of endangerment, they will want to know." "Thank you," I said, carefully folding the document. "I have a file I'll be sending over to your office this afternoon with his dissolved LLC information, bank deposits, and written admissions of guilt." Miller looked at me, a glimmer of profound respect in her eyes. "You're building a hell of a guillotine, aren't you?" "I'm just measuring the wood," I replied smoothly. Returning to Aliner's house that evening required the performance of a lifetime. This was the most crucial, agonizing part of my plan. Malicious compliance. If Chad or Aliner suspected I was building a case, Chad might attempt to hide his assets. He might try to transfer the title of the boat, or worse, his house. I needed him fat, happy, and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. I walked into the kitchen where Mark and Aliner were eating takeout Chinese food. The house smelled nauseatingly of lavender potpourri and old carpeting. "Well, look who finally decided to join us," Eleanor sniffed, not looking up from her low mane. Have you calmed down from your little outburst on Sunday? Mark looked at me, his eyes wide and anxious, silently begging me not to start another fight. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump. I let a look of utter, defeated exhaustion wash over my face. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, staring blankly at the wall. I'm I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It tasted like poison on my tongue, but I forced the words out. I was just stressed about the house. The inspector said it's going to be a long time before we can go back. Mark exhaled a massive sigh of relief, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. It's okay, babe. We know you're stressed. It's going to be fine. Chad texted me today. He said he's looking into sourcing the LVL beam next week. We just have to be patient. Patient, I repeated softly, playing the role of the broken, submissive wife. Right. See, Eleanor said brightly, stabbing a piece of broccoli. Family works things out. Chad is a good boy, you just have to trust the process. You'll have your kitchen eventually, and you'll see it was worth the wait. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By night, I slept in Mark's childhood twin bed, listening to him snore, playing the role of the quiet, resigned woman who had accepted her fate. But from 8 o'clock a.m. to 5 o'clock p.m., while Mark was at work, I drove to the local library, booked a private study room, and became a phantom of bureaucratic vengeance. My next target was the money. Chad had proudly proclaimed that he was using my $50,000 for cash flow and that he had used it to buy a boat. If he was funneling massive, under-the-table cash payments directly into personal luxury assets while his business was legally dissolved, there was one federal entity that would be extremely, passionately interested in his accounting methods. I opened the IRS website and navigated to Form 3949A, Information Referral. This form is specifically designed for reporting suspected tax fraud, including unreported income, kickbacks, and false exemptions. I filled it out with surgical precision. I didn't just allege fraud, I provided a road map. I detailed the $50,000 upfront payment, the lack of any business accounts, the immediate purchase of a luxury watercraft, and his own text messages explicitly stating he was reallocating funds to avoid taxes. I attached the bank routing numbers, the dissolved LLC public records, and the dates of the transactions. I didn't stop there. I filed a parallel complaint with the State Department of Revenue. I filed a massive, heavily documented grievance with the State Board of Contractors, requesting a formal investigation into unlicensed, hazardous contracting, resulting in the condemnation of a residential property. I was systematically salting the earth of Chad's financial life. I was ensuring that when I finally dropped the lawsuit on him, he wouldn't be able to run, hide, or declare a convenient bankruptcy. The federal and state governments would be waiting in the wings to devour whatever pieces of him I left behind. But the federal wheels turned slowly. I needed a guided missile. I needed a lawyer. I didn't want a family law attorney, and I certainly didn't want a general practitioner. I spent 3 days researching the most aggressive, ruthless civil litigation firms in the state, specifically, those with a dedicated construction defect and fraud division. That's how I found Evelyn Vance. Her online bio was intimidating. She was a senior partner at a high-end corporate firm, a woman who specialized in dismantling fraudulent contractors and recovering high-value assets. Her reviews didn't call her compassionate or understanding. They called her a bloodsucker, a shark, and a nightmare. She was exactly what I needed. I scheduled a consultation. When I walked into her corner office on the 24th floor of a downtown high-rise, I wasn't carrying a purse. I was carrying a 4-inch thick, heavily tabbed, meticulously indexed Deering binder. Evelyn Vance sat behind a massive glass desk. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled into a sharp, severe bun. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. $50,000, Evelyn said, glancing at her intake sheet. Usually, for a $50,000 claim, I tell people to go to small claims court or hire a junior associate. My retainer alone is going to eat up a significant chunk of your recovery. Why are you here, Mrs.? Because it's not just about the $50,000, I said, taking a seat opposite her, keeping my posture perfectly straight. It's about the house. He caused an estimated $38,000 in structural damage. He abandoned the job site. He is operating an illegal, dissolved LLC. And he is my brother-in-law, which means he is under the delusion that he is legally untouchable. I lifted the heavy binder and slid it across the smooth glass of her desk. It stopped exactly an inch from her fingertips. "What is this?" she asked, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "That is Exhibit A through Z," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "Behind tab 1 is the signed, legally binding contract holding him completely liable for structural damages, which he signed against my husband's advice because he thought it was a joke. Tab 2 contains the cashier's check, the clearing data, and his own written text admissions that he spent the money on a luxury boat. Tab 3 is the 40-page sealed report from David Aris, senior structural engineer at Aris & Cole, detailing the criminal negligence that led to my home being condemned by the state. Tab 4 is the state citation from the building inspector. Tab 5 contains the public records proving his business license expired 3 years ago. And Tab 6 is the confirmation of the fraud reports I have already filed with the IRS and the State Tax Board. Evelyn Vance stared at me. Then, slowly, she reached out and opened the binder. The room was utterly silent, save for the crisp snick of heavy stock paper as she flipped from tab to tab. I watched her eyes scan the structural engineering report. I watched her read the printed text messages where Chad gloated about spending the money. I watched her trace the line on the contract where he had signed away his own life. 10 minutes passed. When she finally closed the binder, she took off her glasses and looked at me. The skeptical, dismissive demeanor was entirely gone. In its place was the terrifying, predatory gleam of a great white shark that had just smelled a bucket of chum in the water. "You did my paralegal's entire job for her," Evelyn said softly. "I am a logistics manager, Miss Vance," I replied. "I optimize processes." Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, interlacing her fingers. "He owns a home. A 5-bedroom McMansion in the gated Willow Creek subdivision," I confirmed. "Appraised at roughly $800,000. He boasts about having massive equity in it." Evelyn's smile was a terrifying thing to behold. It was sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. "This isn't a breach of contract case anymore. This is gross negligence, fraud in the inducement, and conversion. He signed a contract under the guise of a licensed LLC that does not exist. That pierces the corporate veil immediately. We don't have to sue his fake business. We can sue him, personally. His house, his cars, his boat, his bank accounts. It's all on the table." "I want it all," I said, my voice dropping an octave, the suppressed rage of the last month finally bleeding into my words. "I want the $50,000. I want the repair costs. I want punitive damages. I want him absolutely, fundamentally ruined. I want him to look at me and realize that the family discount just cost him his entire life." Evelyn opened her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored contract. She slid it across the glass toward me, along with a heavy gold pen. "Sign the retainer," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "We draft the civil suit today. I'll have a private process server track him down by Friday. We are going to hit him with a lawsuit so heavy it will crack the foundation of that McMansion of his." I picked up the pen. The gold felt cold and heavy in my fingers. As I signed my name on the dotted line, a profound, chilling sense of peace washed over me. The trap had been painstakingly constructed. Every wire was laid, every charge was set, and every exit route had been heavily barricaded. All that was left to do was hand Chad the detonator and watch him push the button. The silence in the days following my meeting with Evelyn Vance was the sweetest, most intoxicating sound I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a fuse burning down toward a powder keg, entirely invisible to the people dancing on top of it. I continued my charade at Alina's house, washing dishes in her cramped sink, keeping my head down, and listening to her passive-aggressive remarks about my impatience with a blank, agreeable expression. The hammer fell on a Friday afternoon. I was sitting in Mark's childhood bedroom, pretending to answer emails for work, when my phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Target acquired. Package delivered." Exactly 12 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Mark. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Hello. What did you do? Mark's voice was an octave higher than normal, completely frantic, hyperventilating. Babe, what did you do? My mom just called me screaming. Chad just got served with a lawsuit, a massive lawsuit. She said you're suing him for $150,000. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you didn't actually sue my brother. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking over to the window that looked out over Elinor's manicured backyard. It's not a mistake, Mark. I am suing him for breach of contract, gross negligence, and civil fraud. He was served exactly 17 minutes ago by a private process server at the marina. Are you insane? Mark screamed, his panic entirely eclipsing any loyalty he had to me. He's family, you can't sue family. Mom is having a literal panic attack. You need to call your lawyer and cancel this right now. We can work this out. I'll talk to him. I promise I'll make him pay us back, just drop the suit. The pathetic, pleading tone in his voice, the exact same tone he had used to force me into hiring Chad in the first place, crystallized the final piece of my resolve. I had spent years twisting myself into knots to accommodate his cowardice. I was done. Listen to me very carefully, Mark, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute register. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate. Your brother is operating an illegal, unlicensed business. He destroyed our home. He took our life savings and bought a boat. He is a thief and a fraud. I am not canceling the lawsuit. I am going to bury him under the legal weight of his own arrogance. You can't do this to us, Mark whimpered. Here is what is going to happen next, I continued, ignoring his tears. You are going to come home right now. You are going to pack your bags, and you are going to pack mine. We are moving into an extended stay hotel this afternoon. If you argue with me, if you defend him, or if you tell your mother anything other than the fact that you stand entirely by your wife, the next process server you see will be handing you divorce papers. You have exactly 30 minutes to decide if you are my husband or Elinor's little boy. I hung up the phone. 25 minutes later, Mark walked through the front door. He was pale, shaking, and completely silent. He didn't look at his mother, who was sitting at the kitchen table, violently weeping into a tissue, muttering about how I was a demon sent to destroy her family. Mark walked upstairs, packed our bags, loaded them into the trunk of his car, and drove us to the hotel. He had made his choice. It was the first time in his life he had defied his mother, and the sheer terror of it kept him mute for 3 straight days. The lead-up to the trial was a masterclass in Chad's delusional narcissism. He didn't hire a lawyer. He genuinely, deep down in his hollow soul, believed that the legal system would somehow recognize his inherent superiority, or at least be swayed by his charm. Through Evelyn, I received copies of his legal responses. They were handwritten, riddled with spelling errors, and consisted mostly of him claiming that I was an unstable, hysterical woman, and that construction was an unpredictable art. Evelyn almost felt bad for him. Almost. The court date arrived 4 months later. The courtroom was cold, smelling of polished wood and industrial floor cleaner. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn, wearing a tailored navy suit, my posture rigid. Mark sat in the gallery behind me, looking entirely nauseous. When the heavy wooden doors swung open, Chad swaggered in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing dark-wash jeans, a blazer that was slightly too tight, and an open-collared dress shirt. He looked like he was showing up for a bottle service reservation at a mid-tier nightclub. Elinor trailed behind him, glaring daggers at the back of my head as she took a seat on the opposite side of the gallery. The presiding judge was a stern 60-something man named Honorable Wallace, who looked as though he had zero patience for fools. The moment Chad stepped up to the defendant's table, unrepresented, the judge let out a long, weary sigh. "Mr. Chadwick," Judge Wallace rumbled, peering over his reading glasses, "you are representing yourself in a civil suit alleging gross negligence, fraud, and seeking damages in excess of $150,000. Are you entirely certain you do not wish to retain counsel?" "I'm good, Your Honor," Chad smirked, leaning casually against the table. "This whole thing is just a big family misunderstanding. My sister-in-law here just has a flair for the dramatic. I'll clear it right up." Judge Wallace's eyes narrowed into terrifying, glacial slits. "This is a court of law, Mr. Chadwick, not a family barbecue. You will stand up straight, address me properly, and treat these proceedings with the gravity they demand. Counsel for the plaintiff, your opening statement. Evelyn Vance stood up. She didn't swagger, she didn't smirk. She simply walked to the podium, opened the exact same 4-inch binder she had reviewed in her office months ago, and methodically, surgically, began to slaughter him. For 2 hours, I watched as Evelyn dismantled every single lie Chad had ever told. She didn't just present the contract, she projected his signature onto the massive screen in the courtroom. She called David, the structural engineer, to the stand. David calmly and professionally explained to the judge how Chad's work had come within a fraction of an inch of collapsing the second story, categorizing the demolition as criminally incompetent. She submitted the state inspector's condemnation citation. Then came the financial kill shot. Evelyn projected the bank records, she projected the photos of the luxury boat, and then she projected the screenshots of Chad's own text messages and Instagram comments, highlighting the exact phrase, "Just landed a fat 50K job upfront, bro. Gotta reinvest in my mental health." When Chad was finally given the floor to defend himself, it was a train wreck of epic proportions. He stammered. He tried to argue that I had verbally agreed to let him use the money for his own expenses. He tried to claim that the structural damage was due to pre-existing termites, a claim that was immediately shot down by the engineer's report. He tried to appeal to the judge's common sense, arguing that everyone knows contractors use cash flow from one job to fund another. Judge Wallace did not have common sense. Judge Wallace had the law. "Mr. Chadwick," the judge interrupted, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "Are you a licensed contractor in the state?" Chad froze, his tan seemed to pale slightly. Well, Your Honor, my paperwork is currently in transit. Bureaucracy, you know." Evelyn stood up smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant's LLC was administratively dissolved over 3 years ago for failure to pay state fees. I have submitted the certified public records from the Department of Consumer Protection as Plaintiff's Exhibit E." The judge looked at the document, then looked at Chad. The contempt in the judge's eyes was absolute. "So, you fraudulently induced the plaintiff into a contract under the guise of a licensed entity, accepted $50,000 in unearned capital, caused catastrophic, unpermitted structural damage to her home, and utilized her funds to purchase a recreational watercraft. I was going to fix it." Chad burst out, his voice cracking, the arrogant facade finally shattering. "I just needed more time. She's my brother's wife, she's just trying to ruin me because she's a vicious, greedy." "Quiet," Judge Wallace roared, slamming his gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Eleanor physically jumped in her seat. The ruling was swift, merciless, and absolute. Judge Wallace found entirely in my favor. He pierced the corporate veil, holding Chad personally liable for every single penny. He awarded the original $50,000. He awarded the $38,000 in estimated structural repairs. He awarded all of my legal fees. And, in a rare and beautiful move, he slapped Chad with $40,000 in punitive damages for egregious civil fraud. The total judgment entered against Chadwick was $146,000. As the judge adjourned the court, Eleanor wailed into her hands. Mark stared straight ahead, a look of shocked awe on his face. Chad stood at the defendant's table, his mouth slightly open, staring at the piece of paper the bailiff had just handed him as if it were written in a foreign language. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I felt nothing but the pristine, airy sensation of absolute victory. But I knew Chad. I knew his ego was a terminal illness. He would never, ever write me that check voluntarily. 2 days later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chad. "You think you won? You can frame that piece of paper and hang it in your condemned living room. I don't have $140K sitting around. All my money is tied up in assets. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, sweetheart. Have fun waiting forever." I screenshotted the text and forwarded it to Evelyn with a single-word message. Strike. Evelyn didn't even bother trying to garnish his non-existent bank accounts. She bypassed the standard collection methods and went straight for the jugular. Armed with the judgment order, she immediately filed a writ of execution and placed a massive, suffocating property lien directly on Chad's prized possession. His 5-bedroom McMansion in Willow Creek. A lien of that magnitude on a primary residence is a financial death sentence. It meant he couldn't sell the house, he couldn't refinance it, and he couldn't take out any equity until I was paid in full. But more importantly, because he refused to make any attempt to satisfy the court-ordered judgment, Evelyn had the legal right to force a sheriff's sale. We petitioned the court to foreclose on his home to pay his debt to me. Chad ignored the initial legal notices, likely tossing them in the trash, still convinced that he could just wait me out. He didn't realize the severity of his situation until the county sheriff physically arrived at his door to serve the notice of public auction. Panic finally set in. Chad tried to scramble. He tried to take out a massive personal loan to pay off the judgment and save his house. But here is the beauty of meticulous planning. The trap I had set weeks ago finally sprang shut. When Chad went to the banks to apply for a loan, his applications were instantly flagged and frozen. The IRS and the State Department of Revenue had officially opened their audits based on my heavily documented whistleblower reports. His financial assets were locked down tight under suspicion of federal tax evasion and operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise. He had no liquid cash. He couldn't borrow. His boat, the Watermark, was seized by state tax authorities to cover his back taxes before he could even attempt to sell it. He was paralyzed, trapped in a burning building of his own making, and the exits were completely boarded up. The foreclosure auction took place on a rainy Tuesday morning on the steps of the county courthouse. It wasn't like a movie. There was no dramatic bidding war. It was a cold, bureaucratic process attended by a few local real estate investors and a bored auctioneer. Because the house was encumbered by my massive lien, the starting bid was the exact amount of the judgment owed to me. I didn't attend in person. I didn't want him to know it was me until the very end. Instead, I had utilized an anonymous LLC, funded entirely by my own savings, and a quiet, secure loan I had taken out against the future value of my repaired home. Evelyn's paralegal placed the bid on behalf of my LLC. No one else bid against us. The investors didn't want to touch a house tied up in a messy civil fraud case. The hammer fell. My LLC purchased my brother-in-law's $800,000 home for the exact cost of his debt to me, $146,000. The paperwork took 3 weeks to clear. During those 3 weeks, Chad lived in a state of absolute denial, packing nothing, convinced his mother would somehow bail him out, or that a legal loophole would save him. The morning the title officially transferred into my LLC's name, I took the day off work. I drove to the Willow Creek subdivision. I didn't park on the street. I parked my 10-year-old sedan squarely in his pristine, freshly paved driveway. I walked up to the massive, custom mahogany front door and rang the doorbell. Chad opened the door. He looked terrible. He had lost weight, his fake tan was fading, and he had dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, his face twisted into a snarl. "What the hell are you doing here?" he spat, stepping out onto the porch, towering over me. "Get off my property before I call the cops for trespassing." I didn't flinch. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp, white manila envelope, and handed it to him. "I am not trespassing, Chad," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger or malice. "I am the new owner of this property. The LLC that purchased it at the county auction belongs to me. That envelope contains your official, 30-day notice of eviction. You have exactly 1 month to vacate my house." Chad stared at me, the envelope trembling in his hand. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might actually pass out. His eyes darted from the envelope to my face and back again. The reality of the situation, the absolute, crushing finality of his defeat, finally broke through his delusions. You bought my house," he whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified small child. "You took my house." "No," I corrected him calmly. "I bought a house at auction. You gave it away when you decided to steal my money and laugh in my face. You said a judge wouldn't care about family drama. You were wrong." I turned around and walked back to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. Chad was sitting on the steps of the front porch, his head buried in his hands, weeping. The aftermath was brutal, swift, and entirely cleansing. Eleanor, naturally, tried to launch a holy war against me. She called Mark, screaming that I was the devil, demanding that Mark divorce me, force me to sign the house back over to Chad, and apologize. Mark, who had spent the last several months witnessing exactly what happens when you cross me, finally found his spine. He told his mother that Chad was a criminal, that he was lucky he wasn't in federal prison, and that if she ever spoke disrespectfully about his wife again, she would never hear from him. We went entirely, blissfully no contact. Chad was evicted 30 days later. With his accounts frozen by the IRS and his credit entirely destroyed, he couldn't rent an apartment. He had to move back into his childhood bedroom at Eleanor's house, the exact same room Mark and I had been forced to live in when he destroyed our home. The irony was so perfect it belonged in a museum. I immediately listed the McMansion on the open market. Because the neighborhood was highly desirable, it sold in less than a week for $820,000. After paying off the $146,000 I owed to my LLC to cover the auction cost, clearing the minor remaining mortgage Chad had on the place, and paying the capital gains taxes, I walked away with nearly $400,000 in pure, liquid profit. I didn't buy a boat. I called Sarah at Evergreen Design and Build. I handed her a blank check. Today I am sitting at the massive, 10-foot island in my kitchen. The countertops are imported, seamless white quartzite. The cabinets are custom-milled, soft-close walnut. The load-bearing beam is perfectly hidden behind a flawless, smooth ceiling. The morning sun pours through the expanded bay windows, reflecting off the brushed brass fixtures. Mark is standing at the commercial-grade gas range, happily flipping pancakes, humming a song under his breath. The house is quiet, secure, and completely ours. Sometimes, when I'm sipping my coffee in the morning light, I think about Chad, sleeping on a twin mattress in his mother's house, fielding calls from federal tax auditors. I think about the $50,000 he stole and the empire it cost him. And then, I take another sip of my coffee, smile, and enjoy my beautiful, perfect kitchen.